Part III. Swann in Love, Section 22. Meanwhile the concert had begun again, and Swann saw that he could not now go before the end of the new number. He suffered greatly from being shut up among all these people whose stupidity and absurdities wounded him all the more cruelly, since, being ignorant of his love, incapable, had they known it, of taking any interest, or of doing more than smile at it as at some childish joke, or deplore it as an act of insanity, they made it appear to him in the aspect of a subjective state which existed for himself alone, whose reality there was nothing external to confirm. He suffered overwhelmingly, to the point at which even the sound of the instruments made him want to cry, from having to prolong his exile in this place to which Odette would never come, in which no one, nothing was aware of her existence, from which she was entirely absent. But suddenly it was as though she had entered, and this apparition tore him with such anguish that his hand rose impulsively to his heart. What had happened was that the violin had risen to a series of high notes, on which it rested as though expecting something, an expectancy which it prolonged without ceasing to hold on to the notes, in the exaltation with which it already saw the expected object approaching, and with a desperate effort to continue until its arrival, to welcome it before itself expired, to keep the way open for a moment longer, with all its remaining strength, that the stranger might enter in as one holds a door open that would otherwise automatically close. And before Swann had had time to understand what was happening, to think, "It is the little phrase from Von Toya's sonata, I mustn't listen," all his memories of the days when Odette had been in love with him, which he had succeeded up till that evening in keeping invisible in the depths of his being, deceived by this sudden reflection of a season of love, whose sun, they supposed, had dawned again, had awakened from their slumber, had taken wing and risen to sing maddeningly in his ears, without pity for his present desolation, the forgotten strains of happiness. In place of the abstract expressions, "the time when I was happy," "the time when I was loved," which he had often used until then, and without much suffering, for his intelligence had not embodied in them anything of the past save fictitious extracts which preserved none of the reality, he now recovered everything that had fixed unalterably the peculiar, volatile essence of that lost happiness. He could see it all: the snowy, curled petals of the chrysanthemum which she had tossed after him into his carriage, which he had kept pressed to his lips, the address "Maison Dorée" embossed on the note paper on which he had read, "My hand trembles so as I write to you," the frowning contraction of her eyebrows when she said pleadingly, "You won't let it be very long before you send for me?" He could smell the heated iron of the barber whom he used to have in to singe his hair while Loredan went to fetch the little working girl; could feel the torrents of rain which fell so often that spring, the ice cold homeward drive in his victoria, by moonlight all the network of mental habits, of seasonable impressions, of sensory reactions, which had extended over a series of weeks its uniform meshes, by which his body now found itself inextricably held. At that time he had been satisfying a sensual curiosity to know what were the pleasures of those people who lived for love alone. He had supposed that he could stop there, that he would not be obliged to learn their sorrows also. How small a thing the actual charm of Odette was now in comparison with that formidable terror which extended it like a cloudy halo all around her, that enormous anguish of not knowing at every hour of the day and night what she had been doing, of not possessing her wholly, at all times and in all places. Alas, he recalled the accents in which she had exclaimed, "But I can see you at any time, I am always free." She, who was never free now, the interest, the curiosity that she had shown in his life, her passionate desire that he should do her the favour of which it was he who then had felt suspicious, as of a possibly tedious waste of his time and disturbance of his arrangements, of granting her access to his study. How she had been obliged to beg that he would let her take him to the Verdurin's, and when he did allow her to come to him once a month, how she had first, before he would let himself be swayed, had to repeat what a joy it would be to her, that custom of their seeing each other daily, for which she had longed at a time when to him it had seemed only a tiresome distraction, for which, since that time, she had conceived a distaste, and had definitely broken herself of it, while it had become for him so insatiable, so dolorous a need. Little had he suspected how truly he spoke when on their third meeting, as she repeated, "But why don't you let me come to you oftener?" he had told her laughing, and in a vein of gallantry, that it was for fear of forming a hopeless passion. Now, alas, it still happened at times that she wrote to him from a restaurant or hotel, on paper which bore a printed address, but printed in letters of fire that seared his heart. Written from the Hotel Vouillemont. What on earth can she have gone there for? With whom? What happened there? He remembered the gas jets that were being extinguished all along the Boulevard de l'Italien, when he had met her, when all hope was gone, among the errant shades, upon that night which had seemed to him almost supernatural, and which now, that night of a period when he had not even to ask himself whether he would be annoying her by looking for her and by finding her, so certain was he that she knew no greater happiness than to see him and to let him take her home, belonged indeed to a mysterious world to which one never may return again once its doors are closed. And Swann could distinguish, standing motionless before that scene of happiness in which it lived again, a wretched figure which filled him with such pity, because he did not at first recognize who it was, that he must lower his head lest any one should observe that his eyes were filled with tears. It was himself. When he had realized this, his pity ceased. He was jealous now of that other self whom she had loved. He was jealous of those men of whom he had so often said, without much suffering, "Perhaps she's in love with them." Now that he had exchanged the vague idea of loving in which there is no love, for the petals of the chrysanthemum and the letter heading of the Maison d'Or, for they were full of love. And then, his anguish becoming too keen, he passed his hand over his forehead, let the monocle drop from his eye, and wiped its glass. And doubtless, if he had caught sight of himself at that moment, he would have added to the collection of the monocles which he had already identified, this one which he removed like an importunate, worrying thought from his head, while from its misty surface, with his handkerchief, he sought to obliterate his cares. There are in the music of the violin, if one does not see the instrument itself, and so cannot relate what one hears to its form, which modifies the fulness of the sound, accents which are so closely akin to those of certain contralto voices, that one has the illusion that a singer has taken her place amid the orchestra. One raises one's eyes. One sees only the wooden case, magical as a Chinese box. But, at moments, one is still tricked by the deceiving appeal of the siren. At times, too, one believes that one is listening to a captive spirit, struggling in the darkness of its masterful box, a box quivering with enchantment, like a devil immersed in a stoup of holy water. Sometimes, again, it is in the air, at large, like a pure and supernatural creature, that reveals to the ear as it passes its invisible message. As though the musicians were not nearly so much playing the little phrase as performing the rites on which it insisted before it would consent to appear, as proceeding to utter the incantations necessary to procure, and to prolong for a few moments, the miracle of its apparition, Swann, who was no more able now to see it than if it had belonged to a world of ultra-violet light, who experienced something like the refreshing sense of a metamorphosis in the momentary blindness with which he had been struck as he approached it, Swann felt that it was present, like a protective goddess, a confidant of his love, who, so as to be able to come to him through the crowd, and to draw him aside to speak to him, had disguised herself in this sweeping cloak of sound. And as she passed him, light, soothing, as softly murmured as the perfume of a flower, telling him what she had to say, every word of which he closely scanned, sorry to see them fly away so fast, he made involuntarily with his lips the motion of kissing as it went by him, the harmonious, fleeting form. He felt that he was no longer in exile and alone, since she, who addressed herself to him, spoke to him in a whisper of Odette. For, he had no longer, as of old, the impression that Odette and he were not known to the little phrase. Had it not often been the witness of their joys? True that as often it had warned him of their frailty. And indeed, whereas in that distant time he had divined an element of suffering in its smile, in its limpid and disillusioned intonation, to night he found there rather the charm of a resignation that was almost gay. Of those sorrows, of which the little phrase had spoken to him then, which he had seen it, without his being touched by them himself, carry past him, smiling on its sinuous and rapid course, of those sorrows which were now become his own, without his having any hope of being ever delivered from them, it seemed to say to him, as once it had said of his happiness, "What does all that matter? It is all nothing." And Swann's thoughts were borne for the first time on a wave of pity and tenderness towards that von Toye, towards that unknown, exalted brother who also must have suffered so greatly. What could his life have been? From the depths of what well of sorrow could he have drawn that godlike strength, that unlimited power of creation? When it was the little phrase that spoke to him of the vanity of his sufferings, Swann found a sweetness in that very wisdom which, but a little while back, had seemed to him intolerable when he thought that he could read it on the faces of indifferent strangers, who would regard his love as a digression that was without importance. 'Twas because the little phrase, unlike them, whatever opinion it might hold on the short duration of these states of the soul, saw in them something not, as every one else saw, less serious than the events of everyday life, but, on the contrary, so far superior to everyday life as to be alone worthy of the trouble of expressing it. Those graces of an intimate sorrow, 'twas them that the phrase endeavoured to imitate, to create anew. And even their essence, for all that it consists in being incommunicable and in appearing trivial to every one save him who has experience of them, the little phrase had captured, had rendered visible. So much so that it made their value be confessed, their divine sweetness be tasted by all those same onlookers, provided only that they were in any sense musical, who the next moment would ignore, would disown them in real life, in every individual love that came into being beneath their eyes. Doubtless the form in which it had codified those graces could not be analysed into any logical elements. But ever since, more than a year before, discovering to him many of the riches of his own soul, the love of music had been born, and for a time at least had dwelt in him. Swann had regarded musical motifs as actual ideas of another world, of another order, ideas veiled in shadows, unknown, impenetrable by the human mind, which none the less were perfectly distinct one from another, unequal among themselves in value and in significance. When, after that first evening at the Verdurins', he had had the little phrase played over to him again, and had sought to disentangle from his confused impressions how it was that, like a perfume or a caress, it swept over and enveloped him, he had observed that it was to the closeness of the intervals between the 5 notes which composed it, and to the constant repetition of 2 of them, that was due that impression of a frigid, a contracted sweetness. But in reality he knew that he was basing this conclusion not upon the phrase itself, but merely upon certain equivalents, substituted for his mind's convenience for the mysterious entity of which he had become aware, before ever he knew the Verdurins at that earlier party, when for the first time he had heard the sonata played. He knew that his memory of the piano falsified still further the perspective in which he saw the music, that the field open to the musician is not a miserable stave of 7 notes, but an immeasurable keyboard, still, almost all of it, unknown, on which here and there only, separated by the gross darkness of its unexplored tracts, some few among the millions of keys, keys of tenderness, of passion, of courage, of serenity, which compose it, each one differing from all the rest, as one universe differs from another, have been discovered by certain great artists who do us the service, when they awaken in us the emotion corresponding to the theme which they have found, of showing us what richness, what variety lies hidden, unknown to us in that great black impenetrable night, discouraging exploration, of our soul, which we have been content to regard as valueless and waste and void. Von Toye had been one of those musicians. In his little phrase, albeit it presented to the mind's eye a clouded surface, there was contained, one felt, a matter so consistent, so explicit, to which the phrase gave so new, so original a force, that those who had once heard it preserved the memory of it in the treasured chamber of their minds. Swann would repair to it as to a conception of love and happiness, of which at once he knew as well in what respects it was peculiar as he would know of the Princesse de Clèves or of René, should either of those titles occur to him. Even when he was not thinking of the little phrase, it existed, latent in his mind, in the same way as certain other conceptions without material equivalent, such as our notions of light, of sound, of perspective, of bodily desire, the rich possessions wherewith our inner temple is diversified and adorned. Perhaps we shall lose them. Perhaps they will be obliterated if we return to nothing in the dust. But so long as we are alive, we can no more bring ourselves to a state in which we shall not have known them than we can with regard to any material object, than we can, for example, doubt the luminosity of a lamp that has just been lighted, in view of the changed aspect of everything in the room, from which has vanished even the memory of the darkness. In that way Von Toya's phrase, like some theme, say, in Tristan, which represents to us also a certain acquisition of sentiment, has espoused our mortal state, had endued a vesture of humanity that was affecting enough. Its destiny was linked for the future with that of the human soul, of which it was one of the special, the most distinctive ornaments. Perhaps it is not being that is the true state, and all our dream of life is without existence. But if so, we feel that it must be that these phrases of music, these conceptions which exist in relation to our dream, are nothing either. We shall perish, but we have for our hostages these divine captives who shall follow and share our fate. And death in their company is something less bitter, less inglorious, perhaps even less certain. So Swann was not mistaken in believing that the phrase of the sonata did really exist. Human as it was from this point of view, it belonged none the less to an order of supernatural creatures whom we have never seen, but whom, in spite of that, we recognize and acclaim with rapture when some explorer of the unseen contrives to coax one forth, to bring it down from that divine world to which he has access, to shine for a brief moment in the firmament of ours. This was what Von Toya had done for the little phrase. Swann felt that the composer had been content, with the musical instruments at his disposal, to draw aside its veil, to make it visible, following and respecting its outlines with a hand so loving, so prudent, so delicate, and so sure, that the sound altered at every moment, blunting itself to indicate a shadow, springing back into life when it must follow the curve of some more bold projection. And one proof that Swann was not mistaken when he believed in the real existence of this phrase was that any one with an ear at all delicate for music would at once have detected the imposture had Von Toya, endowed with less power to see and to render its forms, sought to dissemble, by adding a line here and there of his own invention, the dimness of his vision or the feebleness of his hand. The phrase had disappeared. Swann knew that it would come again at the end of the last movement, after a long passage which Madame Verdurin's pianist always skipped. There were in this passage some admirable ideas which Swann had not distinguished on first hearing the sonata, and which he now perceived as if they had, in the cloak-room of his memory, divested themselves of their uniform disguise of novelty. Swann listened to all the scattered themes which entered into the composition of the phrase, as its premises enter into the inevitable conclusion of a syllogism. He was assisting at the mystery of its birth. "Audacity!" he exclaimed to himself, as inspired, perhaps, as a Lavoisier's or an Ampere's. The audacity of a Von Toya making experiment, discovering the secret laws that govern an unknown force, driving across a region unexplored towards the one possible goal, the invisible team in which he has placed his trust, and which he never may discern. How charming the dialogue which Swann now heard between piano and violin at the beginning of the last passage! The suppression of human speech, so far from letting fancy reign there uncontrolled, as one might have thought, had eliminated it altogether. Never was spoken language of such inflexible necessity. Never had it known questions so pertinent, such obvious replies. At first the piano complained alone, like a bird deserted by its mate. The violin heard and answered it, as from a neighbouring tree. It was at the first beginning of the world, as if there were not yet but these twain upon the earth, or rather in this world closed against all the rest, so fashioned by the logic of its creator that in it there should never be any but themselves, the world of this sonata. Was it a bird? Was it the soul, not yet made perfect, of the little phrase? Was it a fairy, invisibly somewhere lamenting, whose plaint the piano heard and tenderly repeated? Its cries were so sudden that the violinist must snatch up his bow and race to catch them as they came. Marvellous bird! The violinist seemed to wish to charm, to tame, to woo, to win it. Already it had passed into his soul; already the little phrase which it evoked shook like a medium's the body of the violinist, possessed indeed. Swann knew that the phrase was going to speak to him once again. And his personality was now so divided that the strain of waiting for the imminent moment when he would find himself face to face once more with the phrase convulsed him in one of those sobs which a fine line of poetry or a piece of alarming news will wring from us, not when we are alone, but when we repeat one or the other to a friend in whom we see ourselves reflected like a third person, whose probable emotion softens him. It reappeared, but this time to remain poised in the air, and to sport there for a moment only, as though immobile and shortly to expire. And so Swann lost nothing of the precious time for which it lingered. It was still there, like an iridescent bubble that floats for a while unbroken. As a rainbow, when its brightness fades, seems to subside, then soars again, and, before it is extinguished, is glorified with greater splendour than it has ever shone, so to the two colours which the phrase had hitherto allowed to appear, it added others now. Chords shot with every hue in the prism, and made them sing. Swann dared not move, and would have liked to compel all the other people in the room to remain still also, as if the slightest movement might embarrass the magic presence, supernatural, delicious, frail, that would so easily vanish. But no one, as it happened, dreamed of speaking. The ineffable utterance of one solitary man, absent, perhaps dead. Swann did not know whether Von Toya were still alive. Breathed out above the rites of those two hierophants, sufficed to arrest the attention of 300 minds, and made of that stage on which a soul was thus caused into being one of the noblest altars on which a supernatural ceremony could be performed. It followed that, when the phrase at last was finished, and only its fragmentary echoes floated among the subsequent themes which had already taken its place, if Swann at first was annoyed to see the Comtesse de Monteriende, famed for her imbecilities, lean over towards him to confide in him her impressions, before even the sonata had come to an end, he could not refrain from smiling, and perhaps also found an underlying sense which she was incapable of perceiving in the words that she used. Dazzled by the virtuosity of the performers, the Comtesse exclaimed to Swann: "It's astonishing! I have never seen anything to beat it!" But a scrupulous regard for accuracy making her correct her first assertion, she added the reservation, "Anything to beat it, since the table turning." Part 3, Section 22.